Welcome to the November edition of AML Voices. I'm today's moderator, John Byrne with AML RightSource. And today we're going to take a look at all the activities, issues, alerts, and rules that FinCEN, the Treasury Bureau here in the United States, has been involved in 2024. And I have with me an expert panel. All of us have worked with FinCEN for decades. And so this is always a valuable opportunity for the AML community to talk about some of these issues. Some are pending, some are final, and a lot of the information that all of us need to help our clients, to help our institutions, help our employees, so all the stakeholders. So with me today is Megan Hodge from Ally Bank, Dan Stepano with Davis Polk, and Rick Small at Truist. And so I will dive into it this way. I think it's safe to say that this was probably one of the busiest years that FinCEN has been involved in quite a long period of time with all of the things that they've been dealing with. So I'll start with this. One of the big rocks, if you will, for all of us, Dan representing clients and Megan and Rick having to do implementation, is beneficial ownership. And obviously, there's been a whole host of rules and regs and directions in that space. So, Dan, I'll just start with you. What's the current status of the BOI rules? And I would also say, all of you, feel free to talk about this other part of it. I think FinCEN has done, in my view, a tremendous amount of outreach to the banking community and small business community. They've done a lot of work here to try to get the information out. That was one of the things that we all grappled with when these were being proposed. How's that information going to get out? I mean, you can potentially quibble with some of it, but I think it's fair to say their communication's been pretty strong. But having said that, Dan, you want to give us a quick update on where we are?
Yeah, so FinCEN is issuing three rules to implement the Corporate Transparency Act portion of the Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2020. And this is the area that they focused on the most and where they have made the most progress in implementing the AMLA. So the BOI reporting rule became effective in January of this year. And there's a reporting deadline of December 31 for companies that were in existence prior to January 1, 2024. So what we're seeing with our corporate clients is there's this mad rush to the gate now to try to come into compliance with the rule. And it's interesting because a lot of these corporates, they're not used to dealing with the BSA, they're not used to dealing with FinCEN. So we have a pretty big task in trying to explain this to them. The second rule is the access rule, which also is effective, became effective on February 20th of this year. And FinCEN is implementing a phased-in approach to access to the registry of beneficial owners. And they just came out with an announcement last week saying that they're moving into the second phase. Like they started with a pilot program, and then they're giving access to certain law enforcement agencies. It's going to be a while before banks and other financial institutions get access to it, but at least there is progress that's being made there. And then the third rule, the final rule, is an amended beneficial ownership requirements in the existing customer due diligence rule. And we don't have a proposed rule yet. It's expected soon, and it's expected that the amendments will conform the beneficial ownership requirements in the CDD rule to those that are in the CTA. The other thing I would mention here is that there are numerous court challenges to the Corporate Transparency Act, including one case in the Northern District of Alabama, National Small Business Association versus Yellen, where a court ruled that the CTA was unconstitutional. That's now up on appeal before the 11th Circuit. No decision yet, but there's lots of similar lawsuits that have been filed all over the country. And there's at least a potential for a split in the circuit courts if courts come out different ways, which could be an avenue for this to ultimately be decided by the Supreme Court. And then, John, to your point on the outreach, I agree. FinCEN has been doing a lot. They still have a massive job ahead of them, though. And, I think there's something like 33 million reporting companies that they estimate. I don't know how many of them actually filed now, but it's nowhere near 33 million. So they still have a lot of work to do in that area.
I'm going to turn to Megan and Rick, and Megan's bank is an online bank. Rick is more traditional, so let's get their sense of how they're handling preparation. But I would say that to Dan, building off of what Dan just said, the challenges in the courts, there's also been speculation about potential policy changes with the incoming administration. Everybody is well aware that in the sort of the document that's being used to sort of direct the next administration in some aspects, the Project 2025 did call for the end of the Corporate Transparency Act. So it is going to be interesting to see both, and we'll talk about some of this later, who's going to be the Secretary of Treasury and some of the other positions, because that obviously could potentially change this. But we are where we are today. So Megan, starting with you, how is Ally dealing with a lot of the issues that Dan mentioned? And then Rick, I'll ask you to do the same.
Yeah, I think from our standpoint, we are still in a wait and see things develop phase. We have a limited business audience. We did certainly put together some training and awareness for our employees who interface with the clients to make sure that they were clear on the difference between the FinCEN registry and what our due diligence requirements are. I think that was something that was a little bit confusing to people who perhaps were just reading headlines in the papers that, good news, we don't have to do this with banks anymore. So that was just a little bit of, minor clarification to make sure that we didn't have any confusion on our side. But, we're still just continuing to stay the course with our current CDD practices. Dan, to your point about it being probably a feverish fight to the end here, just anecdotally, I had a couple friends in the last week mention like, oh yeah, I just realized, or my accountant just mentioned to me that I was going to need to, register. What is the FinCEN thing? So it does seem as though the accountants and the lawyers out there are, perhaps aiding FinCEN in their outreach to make sure their clients are aware of things. But I do think it's there's still a lot of clients, as you mentioned, small businesses out there that need to register who haven't, and perhaps don't, maybe even read stuff, but don't think it applies to them. So there's still a long way to go.
Rick?
Yeah, so I'm with Megan on this. I mean, we are obviously still fully devoted to our collection requirements. Nothing has changed there. Like Megan, we did some education internally, and I think interestingly for us, we probably had as many business folks within the bank that wanted to know if they could guide clients to not have to do our beneficial owner collection anymore and rely on the CTA. So we actually posted something internal for our teammates to educate them on the CTA requirements and that we shouldn't be engaged at all in advising our clients about that. And then we posted something on the public website that said similarly, but also said that you as a client have to get your own advice from your lawyer, your accountant on what your obligations are. But I don't see, Dan was talking about a little bit about, and you, John, mentioned that, FinCEN's been doing a lot of great outreach, a lot of FAQs. FinCEN's done a lot of work, which I know we're going to talk about on the various regulations. We're still waiting for at least one major one and maybe a minor. I'm just going along with when it comes, we'll deal with it. If it doesn't, we won't. And we can come back and, for example, talk about national priorities as one where I know a lot of banks have jumped in. I'm sort of waiting, WADING, wading in the water as opposed to not doing anything, but not just sitting back completely. But so.
Yeah, we'll come back to that because I think that's a really important point, Rick. Megan, one of the things in our prep call that you mentioned that I know our community is well aware of is all of the various meetings that FinCEN has engaged their exchanges around the country, many times with law enforcement partners on a whole series of issues, but a lot of them focused on fentanyl and the opioid crisis. Talk a bit about that because I know that you folks have been involved in some of those exchanges. Maybe just briefly describe what it is for those that may not know, and then just the value proposition of being able to have these frank and open conversations.
Yeah, so FinCEN Exchange is another area of outreach that is part of the AML Act, and I think was certainly the first time I've been able to experience participating in FinCEN Exchange was this year. I think they have had certain limited FinCEN exchanges up to this point, but our institution was invited to 3 different FinCEN exchanges. They're really geographically focused, where you had core folks from FinCEN and then banks who had an association to the different geographies, and then law enforcement agencies, the federal level, who had a connection to the location as well. And this year, their focus has been on the fentanyl crisis. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. I think when you have a group of people who are gathered at the behest of FinCEN, it really gives you a lot of permission to speak very freely and frankly from a bank side and from a law enforcement perspective. We came back from the different sessions with, frankly, more actionable intelligence that our team is able to now start going and looking through our data to see if there are different ways and methods that we might be able to identify potential fentanyl in our activity within our institution. I sort of look at it as, the guidance that FinCEN has published is really helpful, but it of course has to be a little bit generic because tactics change, because you don't want to, everybody's got access to that. So you can't quite give the secret sauce, because then you're sort of tipping the bad guys off with what banks may be looking for. But, by being able to talk about it, we got a little bit more information, which was really helpful. I think it really also helped kick off different conversations that my team has had as follow-up discussions to different federal law enforcement agencies, as well as, it gave us the opportunity from the banking side to really advocate for law enforcement feedback, and sort of, again, peel another couple layers off of that discussion to talk about why is it important from a banking side? When we say feedback, what are the different flavors of what it could look like? On the one hand, it could look like, going through and giving like check marks or grades on every single SAR. On the other hand, it could be, having a conversation to say, hey, that particular SAR was really great. And you guys really identified some of the red flags that we're particularly interested in, some of the risks that we're seeing. And that's a very valuable piece of feedback that I think banks are looking for. But I think it's, again, just communication, having that two-way partnership back and forth. Something else we talked about, and I have no idea whether this is going to come to fruition, but banks do have access to the 314A portal, where we get the information for the 314A lists, and on occasion, FinCEN will publish some information into that portal. Maybe is that another avenue that FinCEN might be able to use to give more specific information to banks in terms of how they can identify illicit activity? Not sure if that's feasible, but it is something that was suggested, and I guess we'll see whether that's something that perhaps is a good fit, whether that's something that is possible. But anytime we can get more information in the hands of banks, I think there's always going to be better SARs, better intelligence fed back to our law enforcement partners in FinCEN.
Well, that makes sense. Rick, anything you want to add to that? Have your folks participated at all, or at least have you gleaned any information from those exchanges?
Yeah, so I did. I went to actually a very interesting one that I got invited to in Atlanta early on, and it was actually with Secretary Yellen, and she did a press conference before we got together with the U.S. Attorney in Atlanta to announce a significant fentanyl ring, which was being facilitated by one of the Mexican cartels. And then afterwards, we broke into a very small group, and we had U.S. Attorney from Atlanta, U.S. Attorney from Miami, the agents in charge of the FBI, DHS, IRS, DEA from Atlanta, and it was I was really pleasantly surprised, not unexpectedly, I guess, how engaged Secretary Yellen was, and she's really focused on that. And then these fentanyl groups that Megan was talking about were the kind of follow-up on that. So I have not attended one of those, but my teams have been invited. So to Megan's point about geographical footprint, we've been in most of those, and so we've been invited to all of them, and I've had my team, and same comment. I mean, we're finding them very useful. One of the challenges, I'm curious, Megan, what you think about this is, while it's a great discussion, I haven't yet seen a lot that translates specifically into actionable intel that we can use, other than if they're going to give us kind of names of groups and things like that. But typologies for fentanyl, I mean, there wasn't, and this isn't a criticism. I think it's just the nature of the beast. I haven't seen a lot that we could take away and say, great, we can do a lot more work on trying to stop the flow based on those conversations.
We've got a few little pieces, and I agree, Rick. It's always a question of like, how do you do it? And also part of it is it changes so much.
Yeah.
But we get some information, regarding the precursor chemical codes and how that may potentially show up in comments that we can go data mining for. That was interesting. Also I thought it was interesting. One of the things they mentioned is that often, and this is certainly more relevant to branch-based networks where they're trying to get cash in on the front end. These criminal organizations are sophisticated. They're smart. They're good at what they do, and they sort of have figured out how long banks take to sort of get onto them. So they tend to kind of come in, see quick activity, and then sometimes they're moving on to the next institution or the next, set of accounts before they think the banks are going to start picking up on their anomalous activity. So I thought that was interesting. And something that, again, it doesn't give us truly actionable activity, but it is one more lens that we can apply as we try to look for some of this activity that's not correct.
And I know that our colleague that you all have worked with, Mary Lou Jimenez, was able to get a FinCEN exchange in Puerto Rico, which was important on a number of levels. And they had that just this past, I believe, February, because Puerto Rico had been called out in one of the money laundering threat assessments as a region where there is substantial issues, and so they have that opportunity to share information and talk with one another. So just another example, it wasn't focused on fentanyl and opioids. It obviously focused on other types of issues endemic to that region. So again, I think that those exchanges, at least from what we hear anecdotally, have proven to be pretty valuable. And obviously, Rick, we take your point and everybody else in terms of putting that into usable information after the fact. So I think, but we want to keep, as you have just done, keep encouraging them to do these things. I think that's pretty important. Dan, I want to shift back to a couple of other things that FinCEN's been involved in, and that's the real estate and investment advisor issues. And I'll premise it this way: there was a major story in the Washington Post, I think it was Sunday's paper, about the funding from illegal monies from Nigeria into mansions in Virginia, and they talked a lot about the gap in the real estate rules that allowed that to occur. It was a pretty lengthy story that folks should take a look at if they get a chance. But also, obviously, mentioning and quoting from people like Gary Coleman from Transparency International, folks like that, saying how important it is to close the real estate gap or loophole. So where are we with those regs specifically? And then in terms of your financial institution clients, how does that impact them? What should they know about those regs?
Yeah. Okay. So real estate has been and remains an attractive vehicle for money laundering, and FinCEN has been trying to address that. I mean, they've up till recently, their main approach has been to issue geographic targeting orders. They just renewed one recently, but the real estate rule will become effective in a year. So December 1st, 2025. I think it's interesting in terms of the approach they took. I mean, number one, FinCEN limited to residential real estate, and there's certainly that certainly is an avenue for money laundering that has been used, but so is commercial real estate, but they haven't decided to go in that direction, at least not yet. So there's that. The other thing is that the rule imposes a reporting requirement, but not like a broader program requirement on the industry. And it actually creates a new SAR-like reporting vehicle, not quite a SAR, but sort of like a SAR, that has to be filed on certain residential real estate transactions. And it also, I think this is interesting as well, it creates this cascade approach where, there's like 7 or 8 different parties to a real estate transaction, and you kind of start at the top of the cascade, and if they don't do it, then you go to the second level, then the third level, etc. And the parties can also agree among themselves. I do have some concerns about the workability of that, to be honest, because I think that nobody in the cascade is going to want to put their hand up and take on that responsibility. And so there's a potential there for, a lot of like, finger pointing and thinking the other guy is going to do it when, they don't want to do it. So it'll be interesting to see, how that plays out. So, like a lot of things, I think it's a step in the right direction in terms of filling a gap. I'm not sure it's going to, completely fill the gap, and there may be a need for, additional rulemaking in the future. I don't know that it affects the banks so much in a major way. I mean, the banks already have a SAR requirement, so if they're involved in a real estate transaction and they see something that is suspicious, potential money laundering, I mean, the banks are still going to have an obligation to file a SAR, and they're not in the cascade. I don't think, and they're in their normal role. So I don't know that it affects the banks all that much, but it is going to have an impact on the broader industry.
And then investment advisors, just, one of the funny.
I'm sorry, John, can I just jump in
Yeah,
real
please,
quick?
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Rick.
Because your point, so one of the things that I got some questions about on the real estate, and not specific to us, but banks that have a side business, title company, things like that, which some banks do. So that has been a bit of a challenge, and we've had to look through just to make sure that in our real estate business, I had to validate for myself that we don't have a title business on the side. And I don't know, Dan, and maybe this is a legally scholarly question, but even though it's part of a bank, if it was a standalone title company, I think we'd still have those geo requirements and not just the SAR requirements. So that's just one call out. And I think the other thing that I just thought was interesting is each time they renewed, it looked like they were adding new cities. I mean, we've got a good chunk of the United States is now covered by the targeting.
Yeah, one question, Rick, that I have, and I don't really know the answer to, is like, how do the GTOs relate to this rule, like going forward? I mean, do they exist side by side? Are they parallel requirements? Not really clear at this point.
Well, and then
Good
also I
question.
was looking at the two today just to kind of refresh myself, and it does feel as though, I mean, the new approach is more complicated. Dan, to your point, it's a cascade approach on the new rule versus currently the GTO is pretty, like, the covered business is the title insurance company, right? That's pretty straightforward, and they're the one who has the reporting obligation. And then in, the today GTO environment, it's a relatively simple report that has to be filed. But, the new requirement, which it was just published for comment, I think last week, and there are 60 days for people to comment on it. It's a pretty robust report that would have to be filled out. So that may be a bit of a surprise for folks. And then, I would be curious at your thoughts, Dan or Rick, but the fact that it only covers transactions that involve purchases by a legal entity, so a trust or a business, but it does not cover purchases and, quote unquote, cash by a person, like a natural person. Again, I know that's probably I think that's on par with the GTO, but it still seems as though it kind of leaves a whole lot of risk not covered.
Yeah, it's very limited in its scope, so that even after it's effective, there are going to be gaps that can be exploited.
Yeah.
Just want to remind folks there's a Q&A box, and I'm going to jump to one real quick. Rick, I'll ask you, if your account opening documentation says that the customer will abide by all federal laws, does that create a responsibility for your bank to confirm that they've registered with FinCEN, or is it still solely on them?
Still solely on them.
That's
so
good.
that is the the legalese for us being able to do something. So let's take it out of this realm. But for example, if we identified a customer that violated a sanctions requirement, so we would deal with the sanctions issue, but that means they weren't in compliance with all laws and regulations. That would give us the out to exit the customer without any issues. So that's really a clause for banks, but that doesn't proactively or put a proactive obligation on us.
All right. Yeah, no, let's shift gears a little bit here. Looking at a couple things I know we want to cover. FinCEN has done, and they've done this for a number of years. They have issued a number of advisories and alerts, and some I think we should call out and mention in a little bit: elder abuse, environmental crime. They did one just recently last week, and that's on fraud schemes that involve deep fake media targeting financial institutions. But I want to ask a broader question, Rick, and I'll start with you. These alerts, these advisories are quote unquote guidance. So, how does that challenge the AML professional? Obviously, you want to take these, learn from them, plug them into your training and other places. But what, if anything, concerns you about using more alerts and advisories versus rules and other rule makings?
So I think it's a great division, John, that you say about advisory versus a rule or something like that. But at the heart of these, they do provide most of the time some good information, as we were talking about with the fentanyl. Some of these are a little bit more specific and give us some red flags. Others are more broad based, but give us the idea that we should be looking at some stuff. But there are also nuggets in there that I think go beyond just guidance. And whether we want to get into the debate about the regulation that says guidance, this guidance, and things like that, maybe I'll let Dan weigh in. But in those guidance where they then say file the SAR by putting this information or referencing this, I think we are remiss if we don't do that. But I don't know that. I should say it differently. I think I would challenge if somebody said, "Oh, you filed, but you didn't follow that. Therefore, potentially you have an issue." So those are those kind of things. But where I think it's more important now on these advisories, not just the information that's provided, but the proposed regulation, which we haven't talked about yet, for the AML program, which I think we're probably all saying we're up in the air whether that happens or not. But the way that proposal reads right now, all of those advisories should be brought into our risk assessment process. Right. So we should be using those, among other things, to determine our money laundering risk. And that, to me, is substantial. How you bring those in and how you incorporate them. Can you make a call that it's not applicable so you don't have to bring it in? We were already starting to have all these discussions. We've been already looking at enhancements to our risk assessment process to run up against the new proposal because, and I know you'll be surprised to hear me say this, but I actually thought a lot of what was in the proposal was pretty decent. And it really gave us a way to rethink how we do things. But that's all esoteric now because I don't know if it's happening or not. That's where I view the advisories as they provide good information and we should take that. There are some directions that we probably need to follow, and they would be good for a part of the risk assessment process, but have to figure out how to use them.
Before you other two weigh in, let me ask you, Rick. So your critique of advisories and alerts are not that they're not valuable, they are, but if they become a requirement in any fashion, then that becomes problematic. So you're not saying that an alert on environmental, I'm using one example, on environmental crime is not important, but should Truist, who may or may not have risks in that space, have to plug it in or say they're not plugging it in and why? Is that your major concern?
That is exactly what my commentary is, yeah.
Yeah, and just to add on that, it's been my observation that sometimes these advisories are very broad and very vague, and they may, provide, a new nuance, or it may underscore something you already knew. But sometimes they talk very much about like the activity that's happening generally or what the vulnerable population may be doing, and it may not translate into what's actually taking place at your institution. So it may sort of raise awareness, but there may not be a ton that you can sink your teeth into and actually take and use to make updates and adjustments into your AML program. So I think that all banks should have a robust process to review the advisory, the notice, whatever it is, consider it, determine if other people need to be brought into it or awareness, if there's any training. But you may look through it and it may not have anything that requires action. And I would definitely not want for there to be an inferred expectation that just because an advisory is issued, that means that something in your big risk assessment or something in your training machine needs to be updated, because sometimes there just isn't anything that can be there. And so I think I feel similar to Rick. It's good, but I also don't want for it to be, a rigid set expectation as to what we would do with that information.
Dan, your thoughts?
I agree with all that. I mean, I think that in general, the advisories and the alerts are helpful to the extent that they provide information that is, relevant to a bank or another financial institution. In a lot of cases, they aren't going to be relevant. And I would agree with you, Rick. At least at the present time, they don't have the force and effect of law. Now, the regulator may nonetheless have an expectation that you're going to do something with the alerts, but I haven't seen a bank, for example, that's been criticized for not acting on an alert. So I think where it would be problematic is if I don't know, you pick one, whether it's elder abuse or check fraud, both of which are very widespread right now. And if a bank is missing, SARs in those areas, and they haven't considered the red flags, for example, that are in the FinCEN alerts, then I could see that being a source of criticism. And you make a good point too. I think that if the alerts are something that are now going to be required to be considered as part of your risk assessment under the revised program rule, if it sees the light of day, then that does change things, I think, because now you are giving it the force and effect of law. But we'll have to see how that plays out, and we could talk about that, but I'm not sure where that rule is going to land.
Well, why don't we go to that rule? Because the way I want to frame this is that, the program rule comments were due in October. They've been filed. Some were very critical. Others were sort of mixed, like Rick, that there was some value there. It was definitely comprehensive. I don't think anybody can quibble with that. A lot of hard work went into putting that together. But let's try to connect what's in the program rule as potential new requirements with the recent enforcement actions in the past year, whether they be against large or small institutions, traditional banks, fintechs, or casinos. This is not our turn to call out institutions, because we've all been part of issues in enforcement actions, so we recognize that. But trying to learn from those enforcement actions. So again, start with you, Dan, and obviously want the panel to weigh in. Let's connect some of the issues that were called out in these various enforcement actions with some of the things in the program rule that seem, at least in our view, to be designed to address those deficiencies, if that makes sense. And why don't we walk through some of that and get each of you to weigh in on the particulars?
Yeah, a couple of things that jump to mind for me. The one is the baseline, what would be the new baseline requirement in the revised program rule would be that the rule be effective, reasonably designed, and risk-based. And up till now, the expectation, the requirement is that the rule be reasonably designed. So it's adding effectiveness into the equation, and it's adding risk-based into the equation. Those are things that I don't think anybody would argue that that a program shouldn't be effective and risk-based, but now it's going to be a legal requirement. And when you look at the enforcement actions that have come down, over the past year and a half, I mean, clearly there's an issue with effectiveness. Clearly there's issues with risk-based. So, I can see that interrelationship. Another big one for me is we talked about a little bit is risk assessment, because the revised program rule for the first time would make a risk assessment a legal requirement. It is not a legal requirement presently, although it is certainly a supervisory expectation. And again, looking through the enforcement actions over the past 12, 18 months, not doing a good risk assessment, or at least not understanding the risks in the institution, is kind of a fundamental theme that runs through a lot of these actions. And that's a big one, because the risk assessment, really understanding the risks, is the foundation for the program. And you can't really be risk-based if you don't understand the risks. So those are just a couple areas. I'm sure there's others as well, but those jump out at me.
On the effectiveness, it seems that was a similar argument that when FATF was doing its mutual evaluations, in the early days, it was just, did you have a program? Did you have rules and regs? But not whether they were, did they actually help with asset forfeiture and other things? So they started to look at effectiveness. So that's probably thematically where they got that from. But Rick, your thoughts?
Yeah, so effectiveness is a challenge because it's not defined, and if left. So by the way, the other thing we didn't mention here is, so there's a proposal by FinCEN, but each of the banking supervisory agencies have a companion proposal, and they look almost the same, but they're not 100% the same, and they're only proposals.
Right.
So when we get to final, we could see that, for example, and I'm just making this up, the OCC could decide they want to define what effectiveness is. And so now we have a definition of effectiveness that might just be specific to nationally chartered banks, but not other banks. But for me, the things that stood out, to the risk assessment, to my moaning and groaning for the last 100 years that not required, now we have a regulatory requirement, or could. But what I do like about the risk assessments is, and I know, Dan's point is well taken, that how do you manage a program without your risk, without a risk assessment? I actually think most of us do that today because we know what the risks are and we build out the program. But what this says to us is, at least, and I'm happy to admit, so I do my risk assessments to provide validation to my management and to the board that I've identified the risk correctly. We've evaluated the controls. This is what our residual risk looks like. This, to me, is much more dynamic, and it says you got to do all this up front. It's got to be iterative. It's got to be, as I said, dynamic. You've got to bring in things like SAR filings. You should look at CTR filings. You should look at data that is being brought in by businesses as they're opening accounts. You should look at the national priorities, which we haven't talked about yet. You should look at the advisories. All of that determines your risk, and then you run the program from that. That, to me, is kind of flipping, at least the way that I've done. So that's one issue. Other things that I've seen, and to your point about the recent orders. So there's a call out in the proposal about the organizational structure, that it must enable the AML CFT, as it will be called, and we forgot to call that out, that our names are going to change from BSA AML officer to AML CFT officer. But you have to be able to allow that compliance officer to effectively implement the bank's AML CFT program with appropriate resources and measuring those resources. And as we know, that was a big issue in some of the recent enforcement actions. One of the other issues that I shouldn't call them issues, one of the other components is around much more engagement by the board of directors. So I'm pretty confident that most of us, like we do here, I report to our board risk committee 4 times a year or 3 times a year. I report to the full board once a year. I do some training, I give some data, and they approve the AML program, I should say they approve the AML policy, and we move on. This suggests that the board of directors needs to be a lot more engaged and reviewing and approving components of the program, which we have not done in the past. And then finally, there's a call out, as there are in a lot of different places, to evaluate and look at innovative approaches. I still have challenges with that because every time there are discussions about innovation, there are conversations about what you missed. And so how do you get to innovate? And we know we're going to miss things, and that should be part of a risk-based process where it's okay to miss things. So those would be my call outs for the proposal.
Rick, just on the resources, not being facetious, but wouldn't that help you folks that are enrolled, no matter how supportive leadership is, that it's a call out that the regulators want, or the examiners want to see that the resources are being dedicated to AML CFT? I mean, obviously, you think that's going to be the case in response to some of these enforcement actions, like you mentioned, but if it's in black and white, it makes it harder for, I'll just say this, the business lines to always win over the compliance investigative units. I mean, high level, wouldn't that be helpful? Maybe not the Truist, but in other banks.
No, it absolutely is helpful. But I guess the miss that I have with this is this is really, so I don't know what the proposal's really focused on, but
Right.
the enforcement actions were focused on really about transaction monitoring. I mean, if you really dig into it, it was really about that transactional volume increased and the resources to manage against that didn't. And that, while that's a component of our AML program, there are a lot of other things that we need to do. So governance, we need to be able to do testing. We need, so on the tech side, and there are some call outs on the tech side for resources as well. But this is useful, but I don't want my management and board to just be focused on, one for one. Or do you have enough resources because transactions are increasing? So I think there's a bigger discussion.
All right, that makes sense. Megan?
Yeah, I just wanted to go into the risk assessment process a little bit more, because I think the part that I'm having a hard time squaring in my mind, and first of all, I love Rick's concept that the risk assessment tool would actually be used as a tool, like to actually guide your program and point resources in certain areas, because that's definitely not how it's done. But I think the whole risk assessment process is going to have to get blown up a little bit because, let's face it, the guidance that we have on how to conduct a risk assessment, which is currently not required today, comes from the exam manual that was like first published broadly in 2005. It includes some antiquated things like, the risk of remote deposit capture or things along those lines. So it's kind of a little bit difficult because on the one hand, we're using a somewhat outdated way of looking at risk from a product, customer, and transaction type, but then that's not what actually defines the risk of illicit fund movements. And you can kind of see that in one of the recent enforcement orders where they're really laser focused on some of the misses because of Zelle transactions, P2P transactions, and sort of missing the changing customer behavior. So I'm kind of having a hard time figuring out how do you take a massive, like enterprise-wide singular risk assessment and have it do all the things that it needs to do for all the people. I don't think it's going to. And I think on a transaction monitoring piece, like you really have to get very granular, because if you don't understand the transactions and the client behavior and have the specific train codes and know that your rules are mapped, like you're not going to be able to identify the illicit funds that are moving through your institution. So I still, and I tend to lean towards optimism. So I'd like to think that the risk assessment process will be improved, but I also really do not think that a massive enterprise-wide risk assessment is going to actually help us as banks be more nimble and be more responsive in identifying illicit activity. So I think there has to be an acknowledgement that that's a huge beast that we have to manage. And if you want us to actually identify and respond to emerging trends, we have to have ways to be more nimble at the detection level.
Real quick, based on your comment, Megan, a question came up related to risk assessment. And the question is, to Rick's point of the program following the risk assessment, do we think there may be cases where lower risk financial institutions can actually reduce AML and OFAC controls?
Well, and I think that's one of the points that some of the trade groups tried to make pretty prominently in the response back, which is the conceptual intent, as I understand it, of the AML Act is to have a risk-based approach that should allow you to move resources from lower risk to higher risk. But that's not really the words that were in the proposal that came out. It really talks about putting more resources on your higher risk, but it doesn't really finish the sentence to say, and away from lower risk. So I think that we're all kind of nervous that we're going to have to do more on the high risk, but we're never going to do less on less risky. Now, having said that, I think there are ways that banks can have that conversation. I think that banks ought to be in the best position possible to know what their risks are, what their controls are, and if there are ways to manage the risk by doing a little bit less. I think it takes a little bit of courage, and I think it takes a whole lot of data and documentation to be able to have a meaningful conversation with your regulators. But I know that we've at times been able to successfully make adjustments to our process. I think you're going to be hard to remove a control, but I think it's feasible and reasonable, in my opinion, to streamline a control or automate a control that previously required manual support or something along those lines. But I feel like we're still I think we're always going to be living in such a Monday morning quarterbacked environment that people are going to be very nervous to allow controls to be taken away.
Dan, I'm going to go to you on some of these court cases and how it may affect us going forward. But Rick, you mentioned a couple times priorities. What do you want to say about those? And then we'll go to Dan on some of these cases and again, how they may influence what happens going forward.
So again, I think this is kind of the now and later. So we have national priorities now. Why I believe that's one of the regulations we are still waiting for, which is what it is we're supposed to do with those. I know anecdotally that a number of banks are questioned during examinations, either by the bank supervisory agencies or actually by internal audit within their banks. What are they doing with those national priorities today? My kind of legalese response is I don't have to do anything with them today because I don't have a requirement, but that doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I know a lot of us are looking to see whether or not we have activity that runs up against that, whether or not there are changes we could make to some monitoring rules to see if we could pick it up. So still waiting for that. But then on the other side, with what we were just talking about with the proposed program rule, it's very specific that those national priorities need to be brought in to the risk assessment process, which I don't know if it's something that at least I wasn't thinking about it that way when the priorities first came out.
Dan, couple of cases that we talked about on the prep call that definitely can impact where we go next. Because part of what we want to spend the next portion of the session talking about is with a new administration, there's always new changes, but with a new administration that obviously is not embraced for many types of regulation, these cases definitely will impact the public's ability both to react and maybe even encourage that. And that's the reversal of Chevron and I guess the Jerkese decision. Talk a little bit about those and from a practical standpoint, what you think can happen with that going forward.
Yeah, they're both huge cases. So the Loper Bright case overturned Chevron. And, Chevron, in a nutshell, basically said that if there's an ambiguous statute, that a court is required to defer to an agency's interpretation. So there was really like no discretion under Chevron. Loper Bright tosses that and basically says that at the end of the day, the court has the last word. So if a court wants to interpret a statute in a way that is different than the agency, they can do that. So I don't know how much of an impact this will actually have in the AML context because you don't get that many like direct challenges to agency rulemaking or interpretation. It could come up in an enforcement action, say, where the agency's interpretation is at issue. I think the Jerkese case, though, is really a game changer for the federal banking agencies because the agency Jerkese it's an SEC case, but I think it will apply with equal force, to the banking agency's enforcement actions. And again, what it basically says is that if the agencies are bringing an action that is grounded in law, right? Historically, as opposed to being in another category called equity, then the action has to be tried in an actual Article 3 court, not before an administrative law judge. And in Jerkese, the court said that the SEC's civil money penalties, for example, that are based on fraud have to go to an Article 3 court. The SEC does not have the discretion to go through their administrative process. Now, you look at the banking agencies, they don't have the ability to initiate a case in federal court. So if I'm a bank and the agency wants to assess a penalty against me, and I decide that I'm going to contest it, the only avenue to contest it is going to be through an administrative proceeding. And the bank would have to make its arguments, preserve its arguments through that proceeding that under Jerkese, this has to be tried to federal court. And ultimately, I think the courts are going to decide this, but I think it's going to give the agency some pause. And I'm seeing some evidence of this already about issuing civil money penalties, So this is still yet to be played out, but I think at least in the short run, I think the agencies are going to be a little bit more cautious about where they assess civil money penalties, and eventually there'll be a test case, and we'll figure out, how this is actually going to apply.
Rick, a question came in when we were talking about the enforcement actions, and it's an age-old question we have about SAR filings, but the question was phrased this way: what does the panel think about the massive explosion in SAR filings versus the small number of prosecutions? Again, we've debated that for decades, but are there defensive SARs, law enforcement being overwhelmed, that sort of thing? And this person suggests they've heard several sources in the FBI and IRS mention that nothing under 500,000 is even looked at regularly. Just in general, you don't have to answer the specifics of the question, but just in terms of the SAR space, as the crafter of the SAR regulation back in the 90s, you know better than anybody why it was crafted and all of that. Just in general, where are we today? Again, this is about FinCEN. FinCEN obviously does data feeds on the SARs. Some of these agencies do their own work. I don't think there's ever a one-to-one on any SAR in a prosecution. That obviously wouldn't make sense. But to a banker's point, they want to know, are these things valuable? There's been talk about changing some of the SAR filings, doing shorter SARs for things like structuring. Talk a bit about this whole area that obviously is now a couple decades old.
Right. So there absolutely is an explosion. It has been over the last number of years. There are absolutely banks that file defensive SARs, if that's a term of art. I'm not a big fan of it, but filing SARs because there's actually not really any suspicious activity, but worried that somebody else might disagree with that, or filing SARs on something that the government already knows about and is prosecuting, but banks want to make sure that the government knows that they knew about it as well. So I think that adds to the volume. I do think that SARs are valuable when they provide good information that's actionable information. And I would just challenge on one thing you've said. We have seen on SARs that we filed that cases have been made just on the one SAR. I mean, they're not thousands, but they do that.
Sure.
But they also data mine. I do think the challenge is that, and this is an age-old conversation that Dan and I have had before, is where you have different parties that provide oversight to you, suggesting different things. So if you have examinations where you're getting challenged on your decisions as opposed to your process, you have a good process, you have a decision-making process, you either do it by committee or you have a team that makes those final decisions, and you can articulate how you get there. I don't believe there should be a discussion about whether or not you should have filed. It should just be about the process. But in a lot of instances, it becomes a discussion about you should have filed. And at another place in time, I had this debate with examiners on something that I absolutely thought did not need to be filed. They insisted. I filed the SAR with a narrative that said the only reason we're filing this is because we're being told to do so. That was years ago. I never heard back. But that's just to the point where I think we are flooding potentially the database because we can't act as one. And we talk to law enforcement, we as the banks talk to law enforcement all the time and ask them if they can have those conversations with our oversight so that we can try and get to a better place. So overall, in summary, SARs play a really valuable role. There are way too many, and if there are ways like you talked about with structuring to really start streamlining some of that stuff. And now, I was just doing a report the other day and looking at data. I think for us, about 75% of our SAR filings are fraud. So it's not even, on the real complicated AML stuff anymore. Fraud has taken over substantially, which is another conversation to have. Is this the right way to be getting that information to the government?
Megan, obviously Ally being a different type of institution, but also obviously you have SAR obligations. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Rick in that I think some banks do file SARs that probably don't add value to law enforcement. I personally think we should all, if you're responsible for SAR filing within your organization, I really think we should try to stand firm and only file SARs that truly meet the regulatory requirement of filing a SAR. And I think the word because is the right word to use. And in fact, Rick used it in his example of he is filing the SAR because he was required to. Um, versus there are plenty of times where we can say, I'm not filing a SAR because, right? I'm not filing the SAR in negative media because I didn't see any activity that would be deemed unusual or suspicious, based on the transactions that I'm seeing. I think that at times, the statement that law enforcement makes, and I think they intend it to give banks an attaboy for doing a good job, is like, you never know, like all SARs are valuable. You never know when that data point is going to come in and help us out. But I also don't think that means truly filing a SAR on every single customer you have is valuable, because we really still need to first meet that threshold of, was the activity considered suspicious from our standpoint. And of course, they can't prosecute everything that's going on, but I do think that if there's not a good basis to file a SAR, I think it makes sense that you would have conversations with your auditors, with your exam team, to try to get them focused on what the process is and why you believe the activity does not merit the filing of a SAR, because we all know that just is going to create a follow-on administrative burden. You're going to have to look at the 90-day SARs, which are not required by law, but nevertheless expected. You're going to have to think about, what the activity has been, whether you should do additional steps with your customer to consider them higher risk, et cetera, et cetera. So I think each SAR should be taken very seriously, and I don't think we should be feeling pressure to file SARs that in our hearts we know are not in fact suspicious.
Hey, Dan, with the couple of minutes that we have left, I know whenever there's a new administration, law firms like yours, I'm sure, send client memorandums out. Here's some of the things we could anticipate. Now, not everybody's been named yet, so some of that's going to take some time. But in general, have you folks produced any high-level thoughts about what potential changes, if any, there could be to the AML infrastructure with the incoming administration? Again, I know it's early. I know not everything is set yet. So just sitting here in November, what's your initial thoughts?
Well, I mean, to a certain degree, personnel is policy, but I think that this incoming administration has made it very clear that they intend to take an axe to the rule book. And, they've said publicly, like, for every new regulation that comes out, we want to see 10 rescinded. That's pretty tough math, when you think about it. And I don't know why the BSA would be exempt. I think the BSA is one of these areas that, produces a tremendous amount of regulatory burden and, cost that goes along with it. And, the industry has complained about this for years and years. So I think that the industry will get a very receptive audience with this administration. And it makes me wonder, like with some of the rules that we are talking about, we talk about the BOI reporting rule and the other rules under the Corporate Transparency Act. I could see this administration, for example, saying, look, you've got all these you got this rule that is very intrusive. You can debate whether it's warranted or not, but it is intrusive. You're requiring, 30 million plus entities to provide information on their beneficial owners to this big centralized government database. And you got all these court challenges to it, and one court that said it's unconstitutional. I could see the administration saying, look, let's put a pause on this thing and let these court cases play out, or let at least give us an opportunity to look at it before we decide to allow it to continue to go forward. And you could say the same, about the amended CDD rule, and certainly the program rule, where most of the comments, particularly the industry comments, are very critical. So I think these rules are all in play with this incoming administration. It'll be interesting to see how it turns out.
Megan, final thoughts?
No, I completely agree. Especially if the government is going to have any kind of focus on efficiency, some of the things that we're doing sort of fly in the face of efficiency. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Rick?
Total agreement. I think we'll wait and see. But I do think, as we started out with the conversation, at least from my perspective, a wait and see on requirements that we have now is not the best approach. And I also think, and I think Dan would agree with me, so Federal Reserve is somewhat independent. So they may still continue. The FDIC, somewhat independent. So they may continue for a while. OCC, it's just going to take time for the new administration to kick in. So you could still see, like, I think I saw an article this morning that was saying that The CFPB is trying to push a couple things in real quick. I think you could still see through the beginning of the year, the agencies trying to push some of the stuff. And I think that's a political, just as Dan was saying, whether the agencies want to take that chance or not. But so my point of all this is I wouldn't stop doing what we're doing today, holding out hope that something's going to change.
Megan, Rick, Dan, thank you so much for taking some time with us today. And I think it's pretty clear, as we've said, FinCEN did quite a bit in 2024, and it'll be very interesting to see where we are next year. Thanks, everybody, for joining us for today's edition of AML Voices. Have a happy Thanksgiving, and we will see you in December. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks.